Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session, this deep dive on contagious emotions, bots, misinformation, and digital art. So I'm very excited to moderate this session. My name is Therese Lindahl, and I am a researcher at the Beijer Institute of Ecological Economics, working in the intersection between ecological economics and behavioral sciences. So I have three fantastic speakers with me today, and they will each give a brief talk, each of them, and then we will have a conversation, and also I will give the audience the opportunity to ask questions. So if you want to ask questions to these speakers, then I would suggest that you use the Q&A section of the chat. That's way it's easier to find the questions if there is a lot of activity going on in the chat. And please also use the chat to have your own conversations on the side. So that's it. So the three speakers, I will shortly just introduce them first, and then we just roll with it. So first, now we have Diego. Diego did his PhD at Stockholm Resilience Center looking at the role of arts and participatory modeling in processes of knowledge co-creation. He is a director and producer of film and immersive works, and a researcher at Luxus at Lund University looking at the role of emerging technologies in sustainability transformations. So after Diego, we will hear Hannah, and she is a postdoctoral scientist with a background in psychology and social and affective neuroscience. She is currently a member of the Computational Social Science Lab at the Complexity Science Hub in Vienna. Her research aims at understanding how emotions and social processes influence communication in interpersonal as well as digital environments. And our last speaker will be Stefan, and he's a data scientist and postdoctoral researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Center and the Beijer Institute. He has a background in both environmental science and artificial intelligence. His research explores connections between digital technologies and sustainability, with a particular focus on the promises and risks of social media for public engagement with environmental challenges. So, as you can imagine, we have a lot of interesting stuff before us. So, Diego, why don't you start?
Great, thank you, Therese. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah, great, wonderful. Thank you, Therese, and thank you, Victor, and the team for bringing us together. Really, it's really good to see friends that I haven't seen for a while, unfortunately. So I want to really continue from Ersin's wonderful presentation and share some thoughts on what I think are the roles of the art in the conversations we're having in this workshop. Basically, in a very brief way, I would like to discuss the arts as this essential process that is necessary to create the conditions and the context within which these technologies take place. I think the collaborations between scientists and technologists and artists, it's a very fertile and if not necessary space for researching these topics that we are exploring in the workshop. So I'm leading a formats project called Wild Tech, which is a collaboration with the Guild of Future Architects in the US, Johns Hopkins Immersive Storytelling Program, and it started in a residency that I did at the Sundance Future of Culture. And we're basically running a field scan, a comprehensive field scan of emerging media art and sustainability, looking into projects and labs, tech companies, policymakers, and scholars in this space. So please do reach out if you'd like to be part in some ways of this project. There's a whole set of relationships emerging, a whole ecosystem of practice, I would say, between creatives and audiences and technologists, and there are many intersecting fields that are emerging, and there are so many modalities of art and media art. Nothing is really settled. There are no established forms. There are so many experiments going on. Some claim that just like what happened 120 years ago when the cinematic tools have been emerging, we kind of like experiencing a similar revolution in the way art making and storytelling is happening. And I would say that this has profound implications for the broad sustainability agenda that we explore here. In a paper that came out a couple of years ago from the transformations community, we said that narratives to support transformations require transformations in the ways narratives are conceptualized, produced, and applied. And I would say that this is kind of what is happening in this convergence of art and immersive technology. We are going from linear ways of storytelling to stories that are interactive, they are participatory, they are network, multiple people can have it at the same time, but they also emphasize presence and being there inside these stories as opposed to passive audiences. So Alex McDowell has said that perhaps we're going it's a kind of a return or maybe an evolution on storytelling, where much like in the beginnings of human civilization, these sort of holistic forms of storytelling were helping us to make sense of the complexity of the world. Right now, we're also entering into this space where these sort of non-linear stories are helping us to understand the complexity, which is really growing exponentially. So, of course, there are lots of possibilities in this space, but there are also risks in terms of sustainability. And I think for the rest here, what I would like to point out is just like 3 key areas, which I think point to the role of the artist in helping us to connect these to sustainability concerns. So the first one is sense making and connection. And again, it was wonderful to see Ersen's presentation on Marshmallow Laser Feast work. So this is, I think, a really big part of this to kind of use these technologies and work with these technologies to understand our place in the world and the interconnectedness of the world and so on. And others are working, for example, Jacob Kudstensen is thinking about how do we move through places, in, creating augmented reality experiences that we can sense the world as we move through it, as, for example, in this piece, The Deep Listener at Kensington Gardens. But I think sense making is also about understanding our emotions in relationship to these challenges that we are going through. Just to highlight one of the examples here, there's this immersive AR piece that focuses on the emotion of solastalgia, which is this sort of complex emotion related to loss of environments, as was described by Glenn Albrecht. So I think that these works they can also create a space in which we explore our emotional relationship to these issues. Sense making is also obviously related to visualizing data, and again, the work of forensic architecture here it's really important in terms of using a combination of investigative journalism and these different technologies to actually help us understand the implications of these systems. And in this piece, for example, they visualize air quality and explore it as a form of environmental racism, as they say. Another dimension of sense making, I think, is understanding the possibilities and the implications of these new technologies in our lives, right? So the work of Deja T and Anya Catherine, I think, is a really interesting example here. Because they explore the topics of deep fakes and face swap and create these several stories that never happened, but they try to convince you that they actually happened. And it's deliberately apolitical. So it's really, the piece is in some ways a space for us to understand and grapple with the emergence of these technologies and to see how we relate to that. So sense-making is a big part of the work that is happening in the arts in terms of connections, relationships to emotions, and so on. The other aspect that I wanted to highlight is experimentation. And that is to say, basically, that artists are not only using these technologies, but oftentimes artists are actually driving and pushing the envelope in how this is developed. And we saw brilliantly in the Marshmallow Laser Feast, who certainly has been at the frontier of that. To take one example from my own work, we did a couple of years ago a project called Breathe, where we developed the very first biometric sensor connecting the breath of participants to the Magically platform, an AR platform. And there was a kind of a piece of the technology that didn't exist in that ecosystem. And so we could visualize the participants' breath and connect to sort of environmental data as well around the piece. And because that was the story that we were trying to tell, we kind of pushed the frontier somewhat of that particular technology. And but this is happening like there are so many labs around the world these days, IDFA and Sundance and Climate Story Lab and CPH Lab. There are so many labs that in any lab that you would go, you will see artists actually pushing the frontiers of these technologies. So that's a really important part. Another way that you can see the same point is, for example, the NFTs. You can see how, you know, these experimentation with technologies of blockchain and sort of issues of ownership are actually starting up and being prototyped inside the art world. So art is kind of like operates a bit like an R&D space in some ways, and therefore artists can model the possibilities of these technologies. And I guess the question for us here is like, what are then the potentialities to infuse some of these sustainability dimensions within these experiments? The final and perhaps one of the most important parts that I wanted to mention is diversity and inclusion. And to put it sort of very bluntly, in order to be sustainable, these emerging media forms, they need to mirror the full range of human experience, right? It's not like the way it's going today, really. We really need to acknowledge here that accessing the design of these systems is still very restricted. My colleague at the Guild of Future Architects, Kamal Sinclair, says the story and narrative are the code for humanity's operating system. Emerging media cannot risk limited inclusion and suffer the same pitfalls of traditional media. The stakes are too high. And indeed, the stakes are really high. And again, artists are questioning and trying to highlight these issues. For example, Mimi Onoa did a work who highlights the things that are left out in a data-saturated world, right? What is this library of missing data sets? I'm also thinking here of the works of Amelia Winger-Berskin, who's an indigenous artist, and beyond her work in immersive storytelling, Amelia is also creating design principles, which they call Wapon.codes. It's a really interesting project, and it models a software design system drawing from indigenous knowledge systems as a way to inscribe ethical principles and accountability right into the code. I'm also thinking of, you know, Skawinati Indigenous Futures Institute, or Ari Milenciano and the Afrotectopia community, exploring the intersections between technology and Black culture and so forth. I mean, we really need to be thinking about a diversity of creators to identify the blind spots of these technologies and explore how the risks and opportunities are distributed among various groups. We cannot assume that these technologies are, you know, neutral, and because they will have the tendency to sort of replicate the systems of race and class and gender that are operating. Joshua Breitbart from the Office of the Mayor in New York said, every time you develop a new technology, you need to have a thought process about the history and the system of oppression that the technology is being created and released into. Think about the ways to bend the technology to justice and not allow it to replicate, entrench, and worsen injustices. And this is, again, the importance here of working with between technologists, scientists, and artists to actually be able to spot that. Well, I mean, I think we mentioned yesterday about the range of data that is being extracted, and if you just look at gaze, there's so much that can be read from that, but essentially there is a point of inference on that data, and I think that this is one of the leverage points and one of the key places where we should be thinking about and having these kinds of concerns and working in very multidisciplinary teams. So to just wrap up, and we can flesh out some of these questions in the Q&A, I just wanted to say that now is really the time, if we are to shape an inclusive and a diverse ecosystem of practice. I think what is being built, some people have said that it's really the cultural infrastructure of the 21st century. So the field is really young, but the audiences are really expected to soar, right? So we need to, I think, start thinking about creating these ecosystems of practice and research where technologists, scientists, and artists can collaborate to deepen this sustainability agenda, which at the moment I think is very, very superficial. Just the final point is that I kind of resonate when Andrew yesterday mentioned in his talk that he's not very optimistic about the way things are going. And I think I would go as far as to say that if we are to think about connecting sustainability concerns to these emerging technologies, I think we need to be asking transformative questions. We really need to look at the assumptions of what is driving development here. And I think in constellations like this one, like we are here, I think is where we have the best chances of doing so. So with that, I just want to close it and leave our contact. Please reach out on artsfortransformations.earth/wildtech. And I look forward to the Q&A. So thanks again, everyone, for bringing us together.
Thank you so much, Diego, and so nice to hear, from someone, and also a nice link to the presentation we heard before you, someone who has a foot in each field, both in the arts, but also in the research. So we heard something about potential solutions maybe to problems, and now we will actually hear about some problems. So the problem of misinformation. So first up is Hannah. Hannah, go ahead.
I cannot share my slides, although I could before. I'll reload the site and hope that works then.
In the meantime, I will just remind people to post questions in the chat if you have any, and keep the conversation. The questions in the Q&A of the chat, and keep the chat function active.
Yes, now it allows me to share slides again. Very good. All right. Are you all seeing them correctly now?
Yes.
Yes, good. Good, then I start. As Therese already said, I'm going to talk about problems, but mostly about emotions, because I cannot tell you much about problems yet because I don't have a lot of data yet. But because today is actually for me, and I'm really happy to present for the first time. It's the first time that I present ideas about our project in which we really want to make a deep dive into the role of emotions in the spreading of misinformation on social media. We just started collecting data, which is a very exciting moment. But since we don't have a lot of data yet, I want to today really make the case for why I think thinking about emotions and about other social processes as well is really, really crucial for misinformation in general. I think this could in part also include misinformation about climate change, although we're not sure yet what specifically we will focus on during the 3 years of the project. It could be one of the topics. Right now, COVID is a pretty hot topic with regard to misinformation. And so that's what I'm going to focus on a little bit today. So actually, it's really when COVID-19 broke out in different countries around the world that misinformation became a topic, I think, of personal relevance for most people. Most of us know people who believe things that we clearly consider to be false. And there's a lot of societal discussion and conflicts, very political conflicts around that too. And the process of this strong increase in information really started at the very beginning of the pandemic. So here I'm showing you just figures from 3 different studies that try to track the amount of misinformation that was shared on social media, or the amount of fact checks that accumulated over time trying to respond to all the misinformation about COVID that was shared. And you can really clearly see that from January on and strongly in February and March 2020, the amount of misinformation out there started increasing. Now, we at that point in time, it's almost 2 years ago, we weren't analyzing misinformation yet. We were busy analyzing emotional responses to COVID-19 outbreaks, to the stringency of measures, the social distancing measures that were implemented around the world. And we did a really big analysis, including 18 countries, in which we tried to look at the frequency of tweets that include some kind of emotional expression. So this is one very basic way of trying to measure emotions using social media data. We just look at how often tweets actually include any kind of word that's somehow related to an emotion. And so we did this in this project mainly using emotion dictionaries. And when I say emotion dictionary, I just mean a list of words that are very broadly related to the different emotions that you see here in the graph on the right side. And for me, it's important to say that when I say anger, for example, I mean a dictionary that includes words that really include expressions of anger, like I'm angry, but it's also words that are related to frustration, it's swear words, it's words related to violence. So these are really not specific narrow emotions, but rather broad categories of emotions. And we just looked at how the percentage of tweets that express an emotion changed in the first 5 weeks after the COVID outbreak, which we defined simply yesterday with 30 cases in these different countries we looked at. And what you can see on the right is an example from Italy. And I think the most noticeable emotion is the one in yellow, anxiety, that peaked for the first time. We saw a 40% increase at the moment where the first case was diagnosed. And then later on, in late February, we saw an almost 100% increase in anxiety. That's a doubling of tweets that include words that are somehow related to anxiety. And this was at the moment where stringency of measures, like the measures really became strict. Italy implemented their first lockdown, I think, at that moment, and cases increased. A bit later, you see in blue also an increase in the amount of sadness tweets, as expressions of sadness on Twitter, and you see slightly a decrease in anger. That is not so pronounced in Italy, it was bigger in other countries. And what I really want you to take away from that slide is that the increase of the changes of the emotions that we see here, and especially the length of these emotions staying high, is something we haven't seen before in social media data. So when you look at anxiety, for example, it takes almost, I think it takes 1.5 to 2 months almost until anxiety comes back to the level where it was in 2019. And these emotional things, of course, they do things with people. That we see these large variations here is really only possible. Measuring this was only possible because so many people went through such a similar situation at the same point in time. And when I looked at these data and I heard about increasingly misinformation being spread on social media, this was the first time where I felt like, isn't there a link there somehow? This is when I became curious about really exploring the role of emotions for the spreading of misinformation. And for me, this was just like a correlation. I saw the similar patterns of increase in anxiety and sadness and decreases in anger and the increase of misinformation at the same time. But when I went out and looked at research that was earlier already done on misinformation earlier, I found out that really misinformation, although we tend to think that way, is really a historically very old phenomenon. So during all kinds of societal crises, during wars, during earlier epidemics, we've seen these increases in misinformation and in conspiracies. And the psychological explanation for that is that when people feel so uncertain about their future, when they're not sure they can control their own everyday lives because there's things that can change at any moment, when they feel powerless to do anything about that, then this process of sense making, like where you try to look for simple stories about what causes what, maybe you even find someone to blame, these things kind of allow people to create an illusion of control and of certainty, and in that way to better cope with what's happening. And if you don't have good explanations, then really the simple stories that are offered by misinformation can be very attractive for people. So I think that's these particularly emotional crisis situations and the increase in misinformation we see there are a hint that we should really take emotions seriously when we look at misinformation. And then there's also more individual reasons for taking emotions seriously. And I think we already heard a little bit in, at least in the talk by Victor and maybe some others yesterday, emotions really attract our attention. and they trigger reactions. So they don't, when I'm feeling emotional, I'm not going to stop and think for 2 minutes about whether that thing I'm reading is true. When I feel emotional, I'm much more likely to share information, in particular if the thing I'm about to share is emotional. And so there, sensational and fake news, of course, have a real advantage towards more nuanced or maybe more objective, or if objective exists, news. So like when they really use manipulation of emotions on purpose, news really just have an advantage in spreading. And the last thing I want to say for an argument to focus on emotions is that our beliefs are much less evidence-based than many of us would like to accept, I think. And instead, there are a lot of social motives behind our beliefs. So when an important belief I hold is threatened, especially if it's a belief that kind of also defines me as part of a group that believes something, and then somebody gives me arguments against that belief, I'm really going to feel threatened, and I'm going to tend to defend myself. And there again, emotions come into play. And when we look at solutions in psychology and in cognitive science, most of the current solutions these days focus at the individual level. So they're offered to individual people, and they focus on accuracy. So these are fact checks, these are warning labels, or people are simply told to focus on the accuracy or the trustworthiness of a news source. And we know that these solutions work to some extent, but in my opinion, they're really never going to be enough. They're a start, but we need to think about other solutions in addition, especially because we know that relying on emotions can increase belief in fake news, and that facts alone, because beliefs are such a social thing, facts alone are not enough to change people's minds. And I think this is particularly true when we think about misinformation spreading in social media, because people go on social media for social reasons. They don't go there to find out about the truth, right? They don't go there to critically think about everything they're reading. They're going to connect with others, to have a bit of fun, to see what's happening in the world. And then in addition, on social media, we really have algorithms at play that are biased towards emotional information. They give an advantage to emotional information because this attracts users' attention. And so I think all of this together makes a really strong case for researchers that do research on misinformation to focus more on emotional and social factors, which they're currently starting, but it hasn't been a big topic so far. And so taking all of this together, we thought it was really time to take this deep dive, and I want to now just very briefly tell you a couple of the questions we plan on investigating. So we want to start just with systematic social media data analysis, where I'm most interested in really looking into specific emotions, also looking into what it is about emotions that makes misinformation spread so much more. Is it just the negativity? Is it particular kinds of emotions? Is it their physiological arousal or something like that? And to really examine the dynamic between emotions and misinformation spreading in detail. Then in a second step, we want to do online experiments that in some way try to regulate people's emotions or give them tools for emotion regulation. So basically all of these are going to involve people seeing some fake and real news stories and rating how much they believe in them. And then in addition to them receiving a very short intervention before they go through that task. And that could be as simple as hearing about how emotional manipulation in fake news works, and then we see if they get better at recognizing it. Or, and these are all just examples, there's many more we might want to try, or telling people to kind of become skeptical when they're feeling emotional, to take a short break and to maybe label the emotion they're feeling. And then finally, in the last step, we want to bring these results together to investigate, I think, some of the most important questions in this area of emotions and misinformation spreading. A first crucial one might be if these individual interventions, if we happen to stumble upon some that actually have an effect, can at the large scale affect misinformation spreading on social media. How many users would actually have to do these individual level interventions, or which users, maybe more central users, could be more effective. And maybe the most interesting thing for me is how effective can these interventions be in environments where different content recommendation algorithms are at play? Because I fear that even the best interventions, even if they have some effects, these effects will likely be smaller than the systematic effects of emotionally biased algorithms. And so I think at the very least, I hope that the project will give us some really good evidence that shows that even if we have individual level interventions that focus on emotions, we also need some regulation about what these algorithms are allowed to do. And we really need a transparency about algorithms to understand what they're doing and to discuss about that. That was a very brief sketch of what we are planning to do in the project. And with that, I want to thank you. I'm really curious about the last talk and especially about the discussion later on.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hanna, for such a nice overview of why we should care about emotion when it comes to misinformation. And I think many with me look forward to the progress of your project and to hear more about it. So our last speaker, I will turn to now, it's Stefan, and he will also share some project.
Yes, and I also have problems sharing my screen, so I'll leave briefly, come back, and then hopefully that will work as well for me.
Reloading worked for me.
Okay, so good. So in the meantime, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A section of the chat. If you have posted a question in the chat, then please, you can, it makes it easier for us to find it if it's in the Q&A section of the chat. So please post them there. And let's see if we find Stefan soon again. If he comes back. So I could also, I guess, ask a question to someone of you, and while we are waiting for him to come back.
We do that too, yeah.
Yeah, that we could do. So
improvising a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe I missed it, but when you study the role of emotions and misinformation, what kind of topic will you use, Hanna? Will you choose the COVID? Will you use that now, or will you also move into other types of topics?
Yeah, but when we wrote the project up, we did not have a specific topic in mind. We were still like, yeah, staying open to whatever comes along. But right now, I think if we look at social media, it's really COVID that is out there making up for the vast majority of the misinformation. And so therefore, I think it's a really good occasion to study that right now. But I'm not decided to stay on that. And if other large topics come up in the next couple of months to years, we might look at something else in addition.
Yeah, maybe we will have a new pandemic. Who knows? But anyway,
or a climate catastrophe or
yes.
something like that.
Stefan, you're up.
Great, and you can see my slides now in full screen, I hope.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you can hear me. Good. Yeah, so I will talk about problems as well, and about the project that we started last year around misinformation, environmental misinformation around forest fires. Briefly, some background about the project. As I said, it started last year. I'm working on this at the Stockholm Resilience Center together with Victor Gallas. And we're looking at the spread of mis and disinformation in the context of forest fires. And the first question is, of course, why forest fires? Why focus on those? There's lots of research on climate change, misinformation on social media. That's what's of interest to us. But forest fires are interesting for a number of reasons. And one of the reasons has actually been mentioned by Alex yesterday, that typically climate change is something that is very distant to people. Distant because it's abstract and it's geographically distant. But things, concrete events, discrete events like forest fires bring climate change in focus. And we know, of course, not just since the last IPCC report last summer, which incidentally was released during while floods, fires were happening around the world. So we know that there is a connection between this, and this connection is now being discussed a lot. It's being discussed on social media, and it's being discussed while it's happening. And to give you one example that we are looking at are the fires that happened in Australia, 2019, 2020. We collected 1 million tweets that mentioned those fires, and part of this huge tweet set is, of course, also discussions about how these fires are caused or are related to climate change. And this is reflected in, for example, the hashtags that come up. So basically, the social media crowd picked this up. Australia is burning. It's very, very severe this time. This has to do with climate change. There is a need to act. But of course, this is not the only voice that you hear on social media, on Twitter in particular. That's what we are looking at. But you also find other types of contributions. So here, for example, you have an example for a tweet where someone was proposing that this has nothing to do with climate change. It's actually arson that is happening to a large degree. And this hashtag arson emergency was created in response to this hashtag climate emergency that became very, very popular. This has been debunked. There were certainly instances of arson during the fires, but not at the rate that was purported in these types of tweets that we find here. There's another example I show you from California that was in the run-up to the presidential election. There were large fires in the western US, and there was a similar theme here emerging. So there were discussions about how the fires are related to the changing climate. And then there were also tweets, responses here in this case, that this was actually Antifa protesters that were responsible for these fires by through arson or through irresponsible forest management. That was another example that was given. In fact, if you look closer at all the kind of types of misinformation that are coming up in the context of just the Australia fires, here's a collection of them. So you have this idea that there are lots of arsonists going around and starting these fires. There were things like that it's a fire jihad caused by ISIS, a conspiracy by the Green Party in Australia, that is through environmental regulations creating this crisis. Eco-terrorism, forest management practices were named as the real reason, environmental policies, you name it. So this is a whole menu of misinformation that you actually find. And some of that might be, you might think this is complete nonsense, but it's still finding some kind of resonance. And of course, in terms of emotion, this might actually cause very different emotions in the people who see this and believe it. And the important thing to understand is that these kind of things that are spread on social media can actually have real consequences. So in the case of the fires in California in 2020, for example, one of the problems was that the police was inundated by calls of people who were supposedly reporting on Antifa protesters starting fires. Or people actually went out armed and tried to arrest these supposed Antifa protesters that would start the fire. So this has real consequences, the kind of misinformation that is being spread on social media. And that's why it's important to research that. And what we are hoping to get out of this is, and trying to understand the potential impact that this can have, is actually that looking at something like forest fires can give us both a subject to study short-term impacts, the ones that I've shown you previously, like how this might actually obstruct effective emergency responses, but also the long-term effects, like how is this misinformation that is being spread into this discussion about climate change during the fires, how is that actually influencing the public perceptions of climate change and the public support for climate policies, for example. And the question of which kinds of these sort of interpretations of an event like a forest fire will win out, and which kind of misinformation will also resonate, at least partly, with the public, will have a lot to do with, volume, for example, and the speed with which people are responding, or, how people that are talking about this are connected, in which kinds of networks. And that's where social bots come in, because that's where they're much better at as we are. So social bots are playing a role potentially in magnifying this kind of misinformation. So as a quick definition, what are social bots? So social bots are computer programs that automatically produce content and try to appear to be human. at least in some instances. Some of these bots basically advertise that they are bots, and that's usually for entertainment. So there are examples for beneficial bots or good bots, you could say. But they are widely available. So one of the studies that looked at open source code repositories found that by the end of 2018 alone, there were 40,000 repositories on sites like GitHub, Bitbucket, and so on that had social bot codes that you could easily use for all kinds of social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, you name it, and the availability is increasing. They might not be very intelligent bots, but they're readily usable and usually don't require a lot of technical experience or large infrastructure to use them. So these bots are relevant. And that's what our research is looking at. So we're trying to understand the influence of, well, misinformation in general, but also the kind of roles that bots might play in this. One of the key questions, of course, how do you identify bots? Well, there are a number of tools. In our case, we are using a platform called Botometer. And you can go to their website, type in a Twitter handle, and find out how likely that account is a bot. As you see, I'm not a bot. I have a very low bot probability, which is good for me and for my trust in this tool actually. And we're of course not using the site. We are using an API that Botometer provides so that we can actually check large amounts of accounts for our analysis. And the kind of value that you get back is a probability that a particular account is a bot, with higher numbers, meaning that it's more likely that it's a bot. And the range that we get back through the API is actually a value in the range of 0 to 1. So 1 meaning it's probably very likely a bot, and 0 meaning it's probably very likely a human. The problem with this is that you shouldn't really use definite thresholds if you're trying to assess whether something is a bot or not. So you cannot say anything above 0.8 is a bot. So what we are typically doing is we are not looking at individual accounts, but we are collecting information about large numbers of accounts and then relating that to some of the data we're collecting and comparing distributions and looking at the differences in the distribution of the probabilities of these bot accounts. And I'll show you some preliminary results that we looked at. The first one has to do with the fires in California that I already mentioned. There we just did an exploratory study and just looked at some of the tweets that were mostly sent in the run-up to the presidential election and that were spreading these Antifa arson rumors specifically. But there were also tweets about the fire in general. And we divided this in 3 areas where we say anything above 0.75 we consider to be likely bots. So coming up to 10% of the unique accounts that contributed to these tweets to these about these fires were probably bots with the given likelihood that I explained. What we currently doing is that we try to dive deeper into this and understand better the details of how information is communicated about climate change in the context of a fire and what role bots might have. And for that, we actually did a qualitative analysis, a manual analysis of the most popular tweets, several hundred of them, and looking how they are framing climate change. And if you're not familiar with frame analysis, so the idea is that a message about climate change is given and a particular aspect of that is highlighted. For example, the fact that the science on climate change is settled and hence something should be done about it, or that there are economic consequences of climate mitigation, positive or negative, or that we maybe have a moral obligation of doing something about climate change. So these are the kind of frames that we are assigned to a large number of tweets. And then you can look at which accounts propagated these particular frames and how likely they are bots. And if we're looking there at some of these distributions, and I've picked 3 frames here, you can actually see that there are differences emerging. There are differences in the number of tweets that were available for these frames, but there are distinct differences. So if you look at the settled science frame on the left, for example, it has a much lower probability that bot accounts are involved than the moral and ethics frame. So something that is maybe emotion laden or likely to polarize more gets more attention from bots, apparently. But as I said, this is very much work in progress. Another quick look at the California fires. So we did another analysis there where we used an automatic classification, a topic modeling algorithm that would divide these tweets into topical areas. And we identified 5 major areas that these tweets could be about. One large area was tweets that would propagate this Antifa arson rumor, and that it's not climate change that is causing these fires. Other large group of tweets that would debunk these. And the interesting observation here was that those 2 groups of tweets, so the ones that were spreading this misinformation, the one that were debunking it, both had the highest levels of likely bot accounts. And that's an interesting observation because I think it's worthwhile to explore how this kind of automation might generate dynamics that we probably don't want to see on social media, and that might impact the polarization of the discussions around these kind of subjects. And just to wrap up, been talking a lot about bots, but in some cases there might not be bots involved at all. So a study that we did a few years ago actually looked at how a scientific study about sustainable food, Eat Lancet, saw a huge digital backlash, and we actually approached this looking at the likely impact of bots and found that there basically were no bots involved. So there was a major digital backlash overriding a well-planned science communication campaign that completely wiped this campaign out or overwrote it through that social media backlash that we could see, and it was completely organic. So it was not actually facilitated by bots. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan, for giving us some preliminary results, and look forward to hearing more of your work. So we actually have a question in the Q&A, and I want to reward this person for posting. So I want to let this person in before I ask any questions, and that's Helge Peters. And he has a question for Hannah. See if I can. So Hannah, what, if any, role would you see for qualitative and interpretive approaches in your research program? For example, for understanding cultural difference in digitally mediated emotional experience.
It's a really, really good question. And I think that in general, in my research area, in psychology, and probably also in computational social science, we do qualitative research too little. And I think what I'm currently reading a lot to decide what we're actually going to do, what we actually focus on in this research project. And what I'm noticing is really how superficial all of the things are that get published. It's basically negative posts spread more quickly. And then when you look in detail at the study, it all makes a lot less sense because their definition of what's true and fake or what's negative and positive are all very, very superficial. The same thing is true for when I think about different emotions. We measure different categories of emotions, and sometimes it's this one, sometimes it's this one, and there's so many different contexts in which things are in which things can be misinformation. And my current state of mind is mainly confusion about the only few studies we have there, and I think this is where qualitative and interpretative approaches could have a really, really big value, where we don't just go and measure whatever categories we already have methods for, but really deeply like having longer conversations with people about what it is that actually makes them feel emotional, about maybe giving them a specific example of a fake thing they believe right now and letting them just describe how they exactly feel. I've thought less about culture there. I think I think I just haven't done enough research or read enough about culture to see how we could do that. Of course, it would be possible in theory to interview people from different cultures, but I think it's such a complex topic already that I'm not sure I'm going to dare go that far. And I think I just start somewhere in Austria or something like that and see how things function here. But I think in general, really good question. And I think we should do it more before we go out and measure things quantitatively.
Yeah, so I have a question on since you are both now launching these research projects or in the middle of it, and I also want to hear about the challenges that you foresee or that you have stumbled across, and what are the major challenges for studying these topics do you foresee, or do you have any plans to deal with it? And this is also where you can ask the audience if they have anything to add to this. So Stefan, do you want to start with some insights?
Yeah, one of the key challenges I see is how do we answer the key question behind all of this, and that is what is actually the impact of all of this. So the impact of this misinformation or the emotions, and how do we find out about that? That came up yesterday. There was a discussion about looking more at the individual or the collective impact, and collective impact is I feel at the moment I see that as a substitute in some instance. I think we have to find better ways to actually make a connection between the online personas that we are studying for when we're using social media and the offline personas. And I think that's what you related to as well, Hannah, there, what you were saying earlier. And I think that's the key thing, finding better ways to doing this. It's also something that is quite difficult and quite costly. And there are good examples where this has already been done, where this work has been started, like by Chris Bale, for example, in Polarization Lab. So they have done things like that. But we have to do more like that. So we shouldn't really just concentrate only on the social media side, but also then go out and do these kind of experiments that Hannah mentioned. But it's still tricky to find good ways to do that.
Hannah, do you have anything to add, or?
Too many. I think at first the challenge is how do you define misinformation? People really disagree. And then, of course, there's machine learning models we can use that label specific things as misinformation, others not. But when you actually go and read these things, it's really hard because often they're just really biased accounts focusing on specific facts and leaving out others. I think that's a big challenge. How to measure emotions. We have ways of capturing the frequency of emotional terms. So we even have machine learning models that give labels to tweets. But then is that really linked to that emotional experience, I think? And also disentangling what's the emotions that are elicited by social media platforms, by news there, and what's emotional vulnerabilities of people. So what's their response to the news and what's their emotional state that makes them, for example, in a crisis situation, so vulnerable. I think picking all of these different things apart is really, really hard. Different topics of misinformation, different emotional responses, just the complexity of it all, I think.
Yeah, thank you. We have some more questions from the chat. So I have one for Diego, since we haven't heard from you in a while. So it's from Victor Galas, and he says, I'm curious to hear more about emotional contagion. That has been studied in social media, but can we see that in the arts as well, Diego?
It's a good question. Now, I've been thinking about in coming into the session because the session was called Contagion, and I guess one could think about the arts as a form of sort of emotional contagion. But I'm going to be honest that I don't know very much about it. If there are studies around that, looking particularly at how art has, spreads in networks and things like that. But I would suspect that there's work around that, and we should definitely look into that and see what kind of insights. But just to kind of pick up on also what Hannah was saying, I think that this is one of the reasons why I was sort of trying to say in my presentation as well, that we need to be thinking about these sort of multidisciplinary collaborations to study these phenomena, and oftentimes also do things in practice, like run kind of micro experiments. I mean, Therese and the team there also has been doing a lot of that, because I think that's the issues that had that level of complexity that only by being in the lab is going to be hard to understand. And again, when it comes down to emotions, the arts have obviously very sophisticated tools to work with that, what kind of emotions. And you can think of, for example, photographers or cinematographers who will have very sophisticated language about how to trigger certain emotions based on color and movement and light and shade. And so I think there's lots of knowledge systems out there that can be connected to a research program like that. So I think it's important to think about those collaborations, even at a research design point.
Yeah, we have one question for Stefan in the chat, and it says, "Can we use this tech to track diversity of emotions on ecosystem types?" The question is from Antonio Castro. If so, would that be possible for ecosystems that are not very popular in social media?
I'm wondering if that isn't actually a question that Hannah would be better to answer, given that it's about emotions and we're not really looking that deep into emotions yet. So maybe she can say something. I can just add one point about studying things that are not very popular in social media. Very popular typically or can mean that there's not much data. So that's a problem, and that can create biases that we've come across before. So we were studying, for example, observations of species, particular invasive species, and you do find biases. So things that are not interesting will not come up on social media. So you only get a partial picture. You can still get useful information, but there are biases in this, and the kind of conclusions that you can draw from it are limited by that, of course. And maybe Hannah can say something about the emotions and ecosystem types.
Okay. I can add a little bit first to that point of things that are not very popular. I think just a very general point is, I think it really depends on which ecosystem you mean there, because for some there might be these biases, some you might not be able to investigate, and for others actually big social media data might be the opportunity to find data on that, because like if you look at a very rare disease or condition or something, these people might have a forum somewhere online and they would be very hard to find otherwise. So big data also has the advantage of sometimes these really rare, unpopular things are at least discussed somewhere online and you can find it. But it really depends which ecosystem. And diversity of emotions, it would be so cool. I think, I mean, there's many ways to measure emotions from text. That's like the only thing that I know anything about in terms of measuring emotions from social media data. But I think they're really still being developed, and capturing diversity. There's a lot of different dictionaries. There's more and better classifiers. But I think it's really still early days from my perspective. Many of these measures still need to be validated. We need to know, are they actually measuring something that populations are feeling? For example, when I investigate tweets from an example, we did a really nice study about that. And we know now at least a very simple measure like sadness or anger captures something real. So it kind of correlates with what people say in representative surveys. But from my perspective, I think it's too early to really get very sophisticated in looking a lot of different emotions. I think we need to do the basic steps first to see whether the measures we have are actually valid and don't just produce rubbish. But yeah, I'm not a diversity in emotion expert either.
So we have 2 more minutes just before, and we don't want to be late. So if we want to, as a segue into the next section, which is on regulation. So what is the solution then? And I guess one of you gets to answer beyond regulation. What solutions do you see? And then one of you, the first one who picks, get to answer that question. And if no one, then I would just give it to Diego. Do you see arts, speaking of misinformation then, and the problems you heard from Hannah and Stefan, so can you now envision a way where you can see, wow, this is where arts and artists or digital art could play a role for this misinformation?
Yeah, I could say just I think Stefan wanted to say something, but I could say that, that I got actually a couple of ideas listening to your presentation of how one could potentially go about it. But there are artists working with misinformation and contagion, which I'll put some links also there, which I think could be a good place to also, perhaps even just think about these questions and how to approach them, and if there are new angles.
Yeah. Sorry, Stefan, if I cut you. Do you have any?
Yeah, very briefly, I think the key thing is first to answer whether there is a problem that we need a solution to, because in some cases that is a question that is still open. So I showed you all these examples of misinformation, and some are really fringe things. So the question is, do they actually have an impact or not? Should we even make an effort to study them or counter them to some extent, or will we just have to accept that there will always be some fringe things happening, but they will not have a lot of impact? And then we should maybe focus on other things, like maybe more on the positive communication rather than fighting misinformation. So that's the key question, and that's still open. That question is not answered, and that will come first before we decide on the solutions.
Good. And now I think we have to wrap up. So thank you all for listening in. Thank you for keeping the chat active and the Q&A session active. And thank you especially to the speakers for giving such nice overviews and engaging with the questions. So